Okay, so today's lecture is Notes 10.1, American Indians Under Pressure. We're going to look at corruption and expansion in this unit. But the first part we're going to talk about is the impact of expansion on Native American cultures. Some of the key terms from this unit um, are the Sand Creek Massacre, Sitting Bull, Battle of the Little Bighorn. Some of these you've probably heard of before, at least I would hope so. Chief Joseph Wounded Knee, meaning the Wounded Knee Massacre, the Dawes General Allotment Act. If we look at some of these tribes, we can see that some of these maps will actually change over time, depending on where tribes were located, and as they're pushed towards reservation, depending on what time period we're talking about as far as maps. Geography did influence native cultures, basically on how they live their lives. So in the Northwest, we have a lot of usage of fishing and using the Pacific Ocean as a resource, as a hunting ground for big game, large game. We also have the Southwest, where we see more of farming techniques, usage of the desert to meet their basic needs. Another thing about the Southwest, there was buffalo down there too. It was just more in the Great Plains area, but the southern Great Plains, there was actual buffalo down there too. But we do see most of the Navajos doing actually farming techniques. The Apaches are also in that area, and they were enemies for most of that time period. In the Great Plains, we have the Sioux, Blackfeet, Crows, Cheyenne, and the Comanche. Um, there's more, obviously, but those are some of the major tribes that we have. And when we think of the plains, we need to realize we're talking about this entire area here, that some of that includes, West Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, places like that. We look at Native American land loss. We can see that before 1850, a lot of it was in this Midwestern region. And as we continue to push west after the Civil War, especially, a lot of this other large portion of land is lost, with places like the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, springing up and becoming popular. And then if we look at just like South Dakota and North Dakota, we can see a lot of that land was lost between 1870 and 1890. And then we have Native American reservations in 1890, and they have decreased since that time in size because of land laws. In 1850, gold and silver were discovered in Indian Territory. This caused a large push west. As people began to push west, it definitely changed the face of the territory, and also changed the way that the land was used. There wasn't enough room for everyone. A lot of people wanted land. They were taking over these different areas. And many of the tribes had already had peace agreements with the government that this was already their land. And then they started having settlers move in under the Homestead Act, and that caused a lot of problems. Now, the government wanted to force a lot of them into reservations, and at the time, the reservations were much bigger than we see even today. And then another impact of the settlement on native cultures was the introduce of diseases that they had no immunity to. Many white hunters came west and would hunt buffalo and other game and would just leave them. They wouldn't actually use the meat or anything like that. And that one caused problems because Native Americans depended on the buffalo, and because the waste of resources caused a big impact on native life. And here's the current reservations today. You can see that South Dakota, Montana, and Arizona have some of the major reservations. Okay, so I finished that last segment saying that the reservations in South Dakota, Montana, and Arizona are some of the largest areas, land areas of reservations, and this is a current map of that today. Here's an example of a Calumet man beside Crater Lake in Oregon, and the idea behind this photograph is showing the connection between the native people and the land. And obviously, land is going to be the point of dispute for most of this. Mostly the usage of the land and who owns the land, whose hunting ground is it, why are people moving in and farming, things like that, that causes some of the issues that we're talking about in this unit and section. So some of the conflicts between them. We'll briefly talk about some of them. We won't get to all of them. There's a lot of confrontations between settlers and Native Americans. The best way to describe it is kind of like it's very reactionary. We have the reaction of the Union troops or the federal troops to the response of Native Americans to Union troops doing massacres, and it's on both sides really. It just keeps going back and forth if we look at it kind of like tit for tat. The Sand Creek Massacre actually happened in Colorado. Here's a great example on the map showing you in relation to places like Pikes Peak, Colorado Springs, and Denver. The Sand Creek Massacre area was down here. There were Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes that were along Sand Creek. They actually had permission from the federal commander at the nearby fort to be there. Well, there was a miscommunication between the federal troops and the Colorado militia. So the Colorado militia attacked and killed about 150 to 200 people in the Sand Creek area. Those were Cheyenne and Arapaho natives, and that is one of the examples of the massacres that took place with troops. And sometimes it was militia, and other times it was federal troops. Here's a artist's depiction of what it may have looked like in the Sand Creek Massacre. If you notice there is November 29th, 1864, in relation to the Civil War. We still had not ended the Civil War yet. So at the end of the Civil War, we actually see an increase in troops. Union troops were increased in the West after the Civil War. And one of the things that actually had more people sign up and go west was the reward of spoils. They put on posters and made it a part of trying to get people to sign up for the Army that you could go west, and if you went west and you conquered native tribes, their horses, anything they had was a part of the spoils, things you could take um, for your personal gain. One of the responses to some of these massacres and the response to land, we actually have Red Cloud, an Oglala Lakota chief, and Crazy Horse was a part of that, where they were disputing over the Bighorn Mountains. That was a lot of their hunting ground, and they were trying to put a road through there. So we have Fetterman and part of his Union regiment that was, or federal, I should call it federal, I guess, regiment that was up in the Bighorn Mountains, and they were ambushed, led into a trap, and Red Cloud killed the entire regiment. Now, one of the causes of the migration portion of this is actually the Homestead Act. So, free land was offered if you would go and live on it for 5 years. You had 160 free acres, and you just had to farm it and build a permanent dwelling. Little House on the Prairie actually kind of addresses this. Laura Ingalls Wilder in her early married life, that's what they were attempting to do, was to actually homestead some land in order to gain it. 10% of the U.S. land was given away under the Homestead Act. It was actually over 100 years it was in effect. A million claims and about 270 million acres. Obviously, in most of this Homestead Act and the push for it, there wasn't a consideration on who actually owned the land before. Some of the treaties that were passed, there's actually more than one Fort Laramie Treaty. There's a Fort Laramie Treaty from 1851, another one from 1868. The details of the 1868 treaty: the government said they would not build roads through Sioux territory, and they would abandon three of their federal forts. In this treaty, there was actually the Black Hills were actually included in that. You can see it kind of goes to the base of the Bighorn Mountains over here. Um, where we live, right here in Rapid City, was a part of the Sioux Treaty. In return for that, the natives would live on this given area, and they would be under federal control, and they wouldn't cause any more problems. They wouldn't fight any more settlers. They would just settle down on this area. The goal was for the government, they wanted them to begin to farm and assimilate. Now, if we look at some of this is different here, but we can see some of the Great Sioux Reservation that's talked about in the late 1800s. And you can see as some of those lands are lost, even up until 1910, and then current tribal lands. And you can see some of this is diffused down here, and that's just from the selling of private lands under the Dawes General Allotment Act. Here's a map example of present day reservations and where some of these battles took place. So the Fetterman incident, Sand Creek Massacre, Navajo and Apache Wars, Battle of the Little Bighorn. Those are some of the major battles. During this time period, we actually have the creation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA. They appointed agents that would distribute land and supplies to the tribes. One of the things with the Bureau is that some of these treaties, obviously, they didn't work. We know the land didn't stay that way. People continued to, especially when there was gold found in the Black Hills, people continued to move into these areas. Also, some of the agents that were appointed were corrupt. They took money, they gave more land than they were supposed to, things like that, that was not allowed um, under the original intention of creating the Bureau of Indian Affairs, even though it is still a bureau today that most of tribes run under as far as their federal funds and their law enforcement, things like that. In 1863, Kit Carson subdued the Navajos. And when he basically beat the Navajos in a battle, he sent them on a 300-mile walk to a new reservation. This was from New Mexico into parts of Arizona, I believe. But the idea here was that the reservation was 300 miles away and they needed to move. It's called the Long Walk, is what it's actually called. Um, Many of them died on that. They lost a lot of resources. A lot of them were farmers. They weren't able to farm. The land was different where they were moved to. They were also placed next to their enemy, the Apaches. 4 years later, um, the government allowed them to return to their homeland on a reservation and significantly decrease their land. If we move a little bit southwest, but to more like western Texas area, we have the Red River War. These tribes that were involved in that were actually settlers. They hunted buffalo, but a lot of them actually raised cows and things like that that other Texans were doing at the time. But most of it was overland, and also that the buffalo were being hunted. If we look at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, two Sioux leaders, attacked um, General Custer with 200 warriors. Custer only had 250 cavalry in present-day Montana. Custer and all of his men died. There's a artist depiction down here of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and up here is an example of the Red River War. It's also called like Custer's Last Stand, things like that. Here's an example of the Navajo Indians that were moved and forced to relocate to present day Arizona and eastern